Sometimes the hardest truths come wrapped in dusty work clothes and calloused hands. Sometimes we discover that everything we thought we knew about our own family was built on someone else's broken dreams. In 1873, Victoria Ashford returns to Sundown Ridge after 10 years in Boston. She's come home to settle her father's ranch, expecting nothing more than paperwork and memories. But then she notices Reuben Cross. He works 2 jobs, building houses during the day, caring for horses at night. There's something about his quiet strength that pulls at her heart. Victoria finds herself watching him, drawn to his dignity and work ethic. The whole town respects this man, despite his worn clothes and humble life. But when Victoria learns who Reuben really is, everything changes. What if her family's wealth came at the cost of destroying an innocent man's future? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The black carriage wheels churned up clouds of dust as they rolled down the main street of Sundown Ridge, past the weathered storefronts and hitching posts that had remained unchanged since Victoria's childhood. She pressed her gloved hand against the window, watching familiar faces turn to stare at the returning Ashford heiress. 10 years in Boston had refined her manners and broadened her mind, but it hadn't prepared her for the weight of grief that settled on her chest as the carriage turned toward the sprawling ranch that would now be hers alone, the Ashford estate. Stretched across thousands of acres of prime grazing land, its boundaries marked by split-rail fences that seemed to go on forever under the vast Montana sky. The main house stood like a monument to prosperity, 2 stories of solid timber and stone, with a wraparound porch that commanded a view of the entire valley. Victoria's father had built this empire from nothing, or so the story went. Now, at 28, she found herself the sole inheritor of a legacy she'd never wanted to claim. "Miss Victoria," called out Tom Brennan, the graying ranch foreman who'd served her family for over 20 years. He tipped his hat as she stepped down from the carriage, his weathered face creased with genuine sympathy. "Real sorry about your father, miss. He was a good man, fair in his dealings." Victoria nodded, accepting the condolences she'd heard repeated a dozen times since arriving for the funeral 3 days prior. Her father's leather-bound journal, thick with years of ranch business and personal observations, waited for her on his desk, an artifact of his life's work that she'd barely had the courage to open. "Thank you, Tom. I know he thought highly of you." The foreman gestured toward the bustling activity around the ranch buildings. "We've kept everything running smooth, just like he would have wanted. Got near 200 head ready for the autumn drive, and the boys have been working hard to keep the operation profitable." As they walked toward the main house, Victoria noticed the careful hierarchy that governed ranch life. The senior hands commanded respect from the younger ones. Decisions flowed through Tom to the various work crews, and everyone seemed to know their place in the established order. It was a world built on unspoken understandings and time-honored traditions, very different from the salons and lecture halls of Boston society. "Tell me about the hands," Victoria said, genuinely curious about the men who'd kept her inheritance functioning in her absence. "Are they good workers?" Tom's face brightened at her interest. "Best crew in the territory, miss. Most of 'em been with us for years. Got young Danny who's learning the ropes, and old Pete who knows every inch of this land. Then there's the seasonal workers who come through for branding and drives." He paused, seeming to consider his words carefully. "And we got some good men in town who help out when we need extra hands for building and such." The mention of town workers stirred something in Victoria's memory, but she couldn't quite place what. "Building work?" "Yes, miss. Your father was always expanding. New barns, bunkhouses, repair work. Smart to use local craftsmen when possible. Keeps the community relations good, and some of those fellows do fine work indeed." They spent the next hour touring the various ranch operations. Victoria was impressed despite herself by the scale and organization of it all. The cattle were healthy and well-tended. The horses in the main corral were prime stock, and the financial records Tom showed her indicated a profitable operation that could support her comfortably for the rest of her life. Yet something felt hollow about inheriting such prosperity. In Boston, Victoria had attended lectures on social reform and read extensively about the growing divide between rich and poor in America. She'd even contributed to charitable organizations helping immigrants and factory workers. But those had been abstract causes, distant from her daily life. Here, surrounded by the tangible fruits of her family's success, she wondered for the first time about the true cost of their prosperity. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria found herself drawn to the windows that faced toward town. Sundown Ridge was small enough that she could see the main street from the ranch house, and she noticed a steady stream of workers moving between various construction sites. The town was growing, evidently, with new buildings going up to serve the expanding cattle industry. "Tom," she said, catching sight of a group of men working on what appeared to be a new church. "That building project in town, do you know who's overseeing the construction?" The foreman followed her gaze and nodded approvingly. "Fine work being done there. Fellow named Reuben Cross is the lead carpenter. Honest as the day is long and skilled with his hands. Been building half the new structures in town over the past few years." The name meant nothing to Victoria, but something about Tom's respectful tone caught her attention. "He must be quite capable to earn such regard." "That he is, miss. Man works harder than anyone I've ever seen. Takes on carpentry jobs during the day, then tends horses at the saloon in the evenings. Never heard him complain or ask for special favors, just does his work and earns his keep with dignity." Victoria found herself curious about this hard-working stranger. In Boston, she'd encountered plenty of men who inherited their positions or used family connections to advance their careers. The idea of someone succeeding purely through honest labor and skill struck her as admirable, even noble. "Perhaps I should meet him," she said, more to herself than to Tom. "If he's doing good work for the town, he might be someone we could use for ranch projects." Tom looked slightly uncomfortable. "Well, miss, I'm not sure he'd be interested in working for the Ashford ranch. Seems to prefer staying independent, if you understand my meaning." Victoria didn't entirely understand, but she sensed there was more to the story than Tom was sharing. Before she could pursue the matter further, their attention was drawn to a rider approaching. At full gallop, one of the ranch hands with news about a section of fence that needed immediate repair. The rest of the day passed in a blur of practical decisions and administrative details. Victoria reviewed financial ledgers, approved expenditures for winter feed, and listened to Tom's recommendations for the autumn cattle drive. By evening, she felt overwhelmed by the scope of responsibilities she'd inherited. Her father had made it all look effortless, but she was beginning to understand the constant vigilance required to maintain such an operation. As darkness settled over the valley, Victoria stood on the front porch with a cup of tea, grateful for a moment of quiet reflection. The lights of Sundown Ridge twinkled in the distance, and she could hear the faint sounds of activity from the town's main street. Somewhere out there, she knew, Reuben Cross was tending horses at the saloon, completing his second job of the day. The thought of such industriousness both impressed and puzzled her. What drove a man to work so tirelessly? Was it simple economic necessity, or something deeper? A need to prove himself worthy through honest effort. Victoria realized she'd spent her adult life surrounded by people who never questioned their right to comfort and leisure. The idea of someone choosing to work two demanding jobs, apparently by choice rather than desperate circumstance, challenged her assumptions about human nature and social order. Inside the house, her father's leather-bound journal waited on his desk, its pages filled with decades of observations about ranch life, business dealings, and personal reflections. Victoria knew she'd have to read it eventually. It would contain valuable information about running the ranch and maintaining relationships with neighbors and business partners. But tonight, she wasn't ready to delve into her father's private thoughts and memories. Instead, she found herself thinking about the worker named Reuben Cross and wondering what kind of man earned such universal respect through nothing but honest labor and quiet dignity. In a world where social position often determined a person's worth, There was something refreshing about someone who'd apparently built his reputation through character and competence alone. Tomorrow, Victoria decided she would make a point of observing this remarkable craftsman for herself. If nothing else, it would help her better understand the community she was now part of and the people who made Sundown Ridge function. And perhaps, in watching someone who'd clearly found purpose through meaningful work, she might begin to discover her own path forward as the reluctant heir to the Ashford legacy. The morning sun cast long shadows across the ranch yard as Victoria made her way toward the old stable, drawn by a restlessness she couldn't quite name. She'd awakened before dawn, her mind churning with questions about her inheritance and the life she was expected to build here. The main stables housed the working horses, but this smaller building had been abandoned for years, used now only for storage of old equipment and forgotten belongings. The heavy wooden door creaked on its hinges as Victoria stepped inside, dust motes dancing in the shafts of sunlight that filtered through gaps in the weathered boards. The air smelled of old hay and leather, tinged with the mustiness of neglect. Saddles and bridles hung from pegs along the walls, and wooden crates were stacked in the corners, containing the accumulated remnants of ranch life spanning decades. Victoria moved carefully through the cluttered space, her silk dress impractical for such exploration, but her curiosity stronger than her concern for propriety. In the far corner, partially hidden beneath a canvas tarp, she spotted something that made her pause. The edge of what appeared to be a small wooden object protruded from beneath the covering, lifting the heavy canvas. Victoria discovered a collection of items that clearly belonged to the stable's earlier days. Old curry combs, a child-sized saddle, and there, nestled among the forgotten tools, a carved wooden horse. The toy was small enough to fit in her palm, its details worn smooth by countless hours of handling. Despite its age and the coating of dust, she could see the careful craftsmanship in its making, the graceful arch of the neck, the flowing mane, the sturdy legs positioned as if the horse were frozen mid-gallop. The moment Victoria's fingers closed around the wooden horse, memory struck her like a physical blow. She was 8 years old again, standing in this very stable, watching a boy perhaps 2 years older than herself work alongside his father. The boy had dark hair that fell across his forehead as he concentrated on his tasks, and hands that were already showing calluses despite his youth. He'd been kind to her, patient with her endless questions about the horses, and skilled beyond his years at gentling the most spirited animals, and he'd carved this horse for her birthday, presenting it with shy pride and a smile that had made her feel special, in a way that expensive store-bought gifts never had. "Reuben," she whispered to the empty stable, the name emerging from buried memory like water from a long dry well. The flood of recollection that followed was almost overwhelming. Reuben Miller, no, Cross now apparently, had been the stable master's son, elevated to help with the horses when his father took ill. Victoria remembered hours spent in his company, learning to braid manes and mix feed, listening to his gentle corrections when she held a brush incorrectly or approached a horse too quickly. He'd been her first real friend, the first person who'd treated her simply as Victoria rather than as the ranch owner's daughter. While other children in town had been either intimidated by her family's wealth or obviously coached by their parents to be deferential, Reuben had simply accepted her presence in the stable as natural and right. But then, when Victoria was 9, everything had changed. She remembered the shouting from her father's office, the sight of Reuben and his sick father being escorted off the ranch, and her father's stern explanation that the boy had proven himself untrustworthy. The details had been kept from her, something about missing items and betrayed confidence, but the message had been clear. Reuben Miller was no longer welcome on Ashford land. Victoria had cried herself to sleep for weeks, but eventually the pain had faded. Her father had arranged for her to spend more time in town with other children, and soon after, plans were made for her education in Boston. By the time she left for the East, Reuben had become just another childhood memory, pulled away with outgrown clothes and abandoned toys. Now, standing in the abandoned stable with his gift clutched in her hands. Victoria felt the full weight of recognition. The hard-working carpenter Tom Brennan had praised. The man who labored from dawn to dusk with such dignity and skill, that was her childhood friend. Grown into the kind of man she'd never expected him to become. But how had the stable master's son become a carpenter? And why had he stayed in Sundown Ridge after what had happened? Most people who left the Ashford ranch under such circumstances moved on to other territories, seeking fresh starts where their reputations weren't tainted by association with alleged wrongdoing. Victoria sank onto an old wooden crate, still clutching the carved horse, as conflicting emotions warred within her chest. Relief at solving the mystery of why Reuben Cross had seemed somehow familiar, mixed with confusion about the circumstances of his dismissal. Her father had been a fair man, quick to reward honest work and slow to judge, but also firm about maintaining standards and protecting the ranch's interests. Yet the boy she remembered had been incapable of dishonesty. Reuben had possessed an almost painful integrity, returning even the smallest borrowed tools to their proper places and refusing extra portions at meals despite his obvious hunger during his father's illness. The idea that such a person could have stolen from her family seemed impossible, unless, of course, desperation had driven him to choices he wouldn't normally make. His father had been dying, medical care was expensive, and pride might have prevented him from asking for help directly. Victoria could imagine scenarios where a young boy might convince himself that taking something small and seemingly unimportant was justified by greater need, but even as she tried to construct such explanations, they felt wrong. The Reuben she'd known would have starved before taking what wasn't his, which meant either her childhood judgment had been completely flawed, or something about the official story of his dismissal didn't match reality. The sound of voices from the main yard interrupted Victoria's troubled thoughts. Through a gap in the stable wall, she could see Tom Brennan talking with one of the ranch hands about repair work needed on the bunkhouse. Their conversation reminded her that she had responsibilities here, decisions to make about the ranch's future operations, but first she needed to see Reuben Cross for herself, not as a potential employee or business contact, but as the childhood friend whose absence had left a hole in her young life that she'd almost forgotten existed. She needed to understand what had happened to transform the gentle stable boy she'd known into the respected craftsman the townspeople now described. Victoria carefully rewrapped the wooden horse in her handkerchief and slipped it into her pocket. Whatever the truth about Reuben's past, she was certain of one thing: she couldn't ignore this discovery. The carved toy had awakened memories and questions that demanded answers, and she suspected that understanding Reuben's story would help her understand something important about her own family's legacy. As she made her way back to the main house, Victoria was already planning her first visit to town. She would find a legitimate reason to observe the construction work, perhaps under the guise of evaluating potential contractors for ranch projects. It wouldn't be unusual for the ranch owner to take an interest in local craftsmen, and no one would question her desire to see the quality of work being done. But deep in her heart, Victoria knew her motivations went far beyond business considerations. The boy who'd carved a wooden horse for her birthday had grown into a man whose reputation for integrity echoed the character she remembered. If that was true, then the story of his dismissal from the ranch contained mysteries that she was determined to solve. The wooden horse seemed to grow heavier in her pocket as she climbed the front steps, its weight a tangible reminder that some childhood friendships leave marks on the heart that time cannot completely erase. Victoria's first glimpse of Reuben at work came 3 days later, when she rode into town under the pretense of meeting with the banker about her father's accounts. She'd positioned herself at the window of the bank's second-floor office, from where she could observe the construction of the new church without appearing to do so deliberately. Even from a distance, she recognized him immediately. 20 years had broadened his shoulders and weathered his face. But the careful way he handled his tools and the patient manner in which he instructed the younger workers were unchanged from the boy she'd known. Reuben moved with the quiet confidence of someone who'd mastered his craft through years of dedicated practice. Each motion economical and purposeful. As Victoria watched, she noticed how the other men deferred to his judgment without any apparent resentment. When a disagreement arose about the proper angle for a roof beam, they turned to Reuben for resolution. When a new worker struggled with a complex joint, Reuben stepped in to demonstrate the technique with gentle correction rather than harsh criticism. Here was a man who led through competence and character, rather than volume or authority. What struck Victoria most forcefully was the sight of Reuben's work gloves, worn leather things that had clearly seen years of hard use, patched in places where the material had worn through. They spoke of a man who took care of his equipment but couldn't afford to replace items until they were completely beyond repair. The gloves became, in Victoria's mind, a symbol of his dignity maintained despite circumstances that would have broken lesser men. After concluding her banking business, Victoria found herself walking slowly past the construction site, hoping for a closer look without making her interest obvious. She needn't have worried about detection. Reuben was completely absorbed in fitting a particularly challenging piece of trim work. His attention focused with the intensity she remembered from their childhood. Afternoon. "Miss Ashford," called out James Whitman, the town's mayor, who'd been overseeing the church project. "Fine to see you taking an interest in our community improvements." Victoria nodded politely, aware that several of the workers had paused in their tasks to acknowledge her presence. All except Reuben, who continued his work without looking up. Whether this was due to professional focus or deliberate avoidance, she couldn't determine. "The craftsmanship appears excellent," Victoria said, genuinely impressed by the quality of the construction. "You've chosen your builders well." "That we have," Whitman agreed with evident pride. "Reuben Cross there is the finest carpenter in 3 counties. Been transforming our little town with his skills, and never charges more than fair wages despite the quality of his work." The mayor's praise was clearly heartfelt, and Victoria noticed approving nods from the other workers. This was a man respected not just for his abilities, but for his character, a rare combination in any profession. That evening, Victoria's curiosity led her to the Red Horse Saloon, where Tom Brennan had mentioned Reuben worked his second job. She positioned herself in the hotel dining room across the street, from where she could observe the saloon's rear entrance, where the stables were located. Near sunset, she watched Reuben emerge from the church construction site, his tool bag slung over one shoulder. Instead of heading home to rest after a long day of physical labor, he walked directly to the saloon's back entrance and disappeared into the stables. Within minutes, she could see him through the open doors, already at work grooming horses and cleaning stalls. Victoria found herself both impressed and troubled by this display of tireless industry. The physical demands of carpentry were considerable, yet Reuben transitioned immediately to equally demanding stable work without any apparent pause for rest or recuperation. She tried to imagine maintaining such a schedule week after week, year after year, and felt exhausted just thinking about it. What drove such relentless dedication to work? Was it simple economic necessity? Or something deeper, perhaps a need to prove his worth through constant demonstration of value? Victoria realized she'd never in her life worked even a single job with such commitment, let alone 2. As the days passed, Victoria found herself developing a routine of observation. She would find excuses to visit town during the day, watching Reuben direct construction projects with quiet authority. In the evenings, she would walk past the saloon, noting the late hours he kept tending the horses. His dedication was absolute, his reputation spotless, and his independence fiercely maintained. This last point became clear when Victoria attempted her first gesture of indirect assistance. Learning from Tom that Reuben's crew often worked with inadequate tools, sharing hammers and making do with dulled saws, she arranged for a supply of quality equipment to be delivered anonymously to the church construction site. The response was swift and unambiguous. By noon the next day, the tools had been returned to the hardware store with payment for their full value and a polite but firm message that the church project had no need for charity. Victoria learned of this development from the store owner, who expressed admiration for Reuben's principled stance, even as he wondered about the identity of the would-be benefactor. The rejection stung more than Victoria had expected. In Boston, her charitable contributions had been received with gratitude and recognition. Here, her attempt to help had been interpreted as condescension and firmly rebuffed. She began to understand that Reuben's independence wasn't just a personality trait, it was a carefully maintained defense against a world that might see his circumstances as grounds for pity. Victoria's respect for him grew, even as her frustration mounted. How could she bridge the gap between them when he seemed determined to maintain absolute self-reliance? How could she address the questions raised by her childhood memories when he apparently preferred to pretend their shared past had never existed? The answer came unexpectedly during her 4th day of observation. While watching the church construction from across the street, Victoria noticed a young apprentice struggling with a heavy beam that was clearly beyond his capacity to handle safely. Without thinking, she stepped into the street to warn him, just as his grip failed and the beam began to fall. Reuben appeared as if from nowhere, catching the beam and guiding it safely to the ground, while pushing the young man clear of danger. Only then did he look up to see Victoria standing in the middle of the street, her face pale with concern for the workers' safety. For a long moment, their eyes met across the dusty space. Recognition flickered in Reuben's gaze, followed by something that might have been surprise, wariness, or perhaps simple acknowledgement of their shared concern for the young man's welfare. "Thank you," Victoria said quietly, her voice carrying clearly in the sudden stillness that had fallen over the construction site. Reuben nodded once, his expression unreadable. "No harm done," he replied, his voice deeper than she remembered, but carrying the same gentle cadence that had comforted her during childhood storms. It wasn't much, barely a dozen words exchanged in front of curious witnesses. But for Victoria, it felt like the first crack in a wall that had stood between them for nearly 20 years. The question now was whether that crack could be widened into an opening for the conversation she desperately needed to have. The breakthrough Victoria had been hoping for came when she decided to sort through her father's study in earnest. She'd been avoiding the task, reluctant to disturb the personal sanctuary where he'd conducted ranch business and spent his quiet evening hours. But practical matters demanded attention. Legal documents needed review, and the ranch's ongoing operations required decisions that only she could make. Her father's desk was a massive oak piece that dominated one corner of the room, its surface still bearing the leather blotter where he'd written his final letters. The drawers were meticulously organized, filled with correspondence, financial records, and personal memorabilia accumulated over decades of ranch management. In the bottom drawer, wrapped in tissue paper, Victoria discovered a faded family photograph that stopped her cold. The picture showed the Ashford family posed formally in front of the main house. But what caught Victoria's attention was the group of ranch employees standing respectfully to one side. There, unmistakably, was a younger version of Reuben's father holding the hand of a dark-haired boy who couldn't have been more than 10 years old. Even in the sepia tones of the old photograph, Victoria could see the intelligence and kindness in young Reuben's eyes. The photograph transported her back to that golden period of childhood when friendship had seemed so simple and natural. She remembered the day this picture was taken. Her mother had insisted on including the ranch hands as recognition of their loyalty and service. Reuben had been nervous about being photographed, uncomfortable in his Sunday clothes, and unsure where to look. Victoria had whispered encouragement to him during the long minutes the photographer required to set up his equipment. Looking at the image now, Victoria was struck by how happy they'd all appeared. Her parents stood with obvious pride in their accomplishment. The ranch hands seemed genuinely pleased to be included, and she herself, barely 8 years old, was beaming with the uncomplicated joy of childhood. Even Reuben, despite his nervousness, showed the beginning of a smile as he looked towards something beyond the camera's frame. What had that boy been looking at? Victoria studied the photograph more closely and realized with a start that Reuben's gaze was directed toward her. Even then, even at such a young age, he'd been watching out for her, ready to offer encouragement or assistance if she needed it. The realization brought tears to her eyes as she thought about all the years that had passed since that photograph was taken. How different their lives had become, how far apart their circumstances had carried them. Yet here they were, both back in Sundown Ridge, orbiting each other like planets whose gravitational pull had never quite been broken. That evening, Victoria made a decision that she knew was probably foolish, but felt absolutely necessary. Instead of sending one of the ranch hands into town on errands, she drove the small buggy herself and timed her arrival at the Red Horse Saloon to coincide with Reuben's evening work schedule. The saloon stables were located behind the main building, connected by a covered walkway that allowed patrons to check on their horses without venturing into the weather. Victoria could hear Reuben's voice before she saw him, speaking in low, soothing tones to a restless mare who was clearly uncomfortable in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Easy now, girl," he was saying as Victoria approached the stable entrance. "You're safe here. Just let me get this burr out of your mane, and you'll feel much better." Victoria watched from the shadows as Reuben worked with infinite patience to untangle the mare's hair, his movements gentle despite the animal's nervous dancing. When a particularly sharp movement caused the horse to step dangerously close to his feet, he simply shifted his position without interrupting his soothing commentary. "You've got spirit. I'll give you that," he continued, his voice carrying the same patient warmth Victoria remembered from their childhood. "Reminds me of another stubborn creature I used to know. She had opinions about everything and wasn't shy about sharing them." The comment seemed directed at the horse, but something in his tone made Victoria wonder if he was thinking about their shared past. Before she could lose her nerve, she stepped into the circle of lamplight that illuminated the stable area. "Some creatures are worth the extra patience," she said quietly, hoping her voice wouldn't startle the already nervous mare. Reuben's hands stilled for a moment before he continued his work. But Victoria noticed the slight tension that entered his posture. "Miss Ashford," he acknowledged without looking up. "Bit late to be checking on town business, isn't it?" "I wanted to thank you properly for what you did today," Victoria said, moving slowly closer but maintaining a respectful distance. "That young man could have been seriously hurt." "Part of the job," Reuben replied, finally freeing the last of the burrs from the mare's mane. "Looking out for the crew is what a foreman does." Victoria watched as he stroked the horse's neck, his touch confident and reassuring. The mare had calmed considerably under his attention, no longer dancing nervously, but standing quietly while he completed his work. "You always were good with horses," Victoria said softly, the words escaping before she could stop them. This time Reuben did look up, his eyes meeting hers in the lamplight. For a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of unspoken history hanging between them like morning fog. "That was a long time ago," he said finally, his voice carefully neutral. "Yes, it was," Victoria agreed. "But some things don't change, do they? You still have the same gentle way with frightened creatures?" Reuben's expression remained guarded, but Victoria thought she detected a flicker of something. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe just wariness about where this conversation might lead. "Miss Ashford," he said, straightening to his full height and regarding her with polite formality, "I appreciate you taking the time to come by, but I've got work to finish here. These horses won't tend themselves." The dismissal was courteous but firm, and Victoria recognized that she'd pushed as far as she dared for one evening. But she'd achieved something important. They'd acknowledged their shared past, however briefly. It was a foundation she could build on, given time and patience. "Of course," she said, stepping back toward the stable entrance. "I shouldn't keep you from your work." "Good evening, Reuben." The use of his first name caused him to stiffen slightly, but he didn't correct her. "Evening, miss." As Victoria walked back to her buggy, she felt both encouraged and frustrated by the encounter. Reuben had recognized her, remembered their past, but was clearly determined to maintain the distance that circumstances had imposed between them. Breaking through his carefully constructed barriers would require more than nostalgic references to childhood friendship, but the faded photograph tucked safely in her reticule reminded her that there had been genuine affection between them once. Perhaps with patience and understanding, that connection could be restored. Victoria's growing awareness of the gulf between her life and Reuben's began to weigh heavily on her conscience as she settled into the routine of ranch management. Each morning brought decisions that affected dozens of employees and their families. Yet she made those choices from the comfort of her father's oak-paneled office, while Reuben began his days before dawn, his hands already rough with honest labor before she'd finished her first cup of coffee. The silver pocket watch that had belonged to her father became a constant reminder of these disparities. She'd taken to carrying it as a way of honoring his memory, but its weight in her pocket seemed to grow heavier each day. The watch was worth more than most men in Sundown Ridge earned in a year, yet to her family it had been simply one of many inherited luxuries. On a Tuesday morning, while reviewing the ranch's financial records, Victoria decided to investigate the business relationships her father had maintained with local contractors and suppliers. If she was going to understand the community she'd inherited, she needed to know how the Ashford ranch interacted with the broader economy of Sundown Ridge. The ledgers revealed a pattern that troubled her. While her father had been generous in his payments to established businesses, the bank, the railroad, suppliers in distant cities, his rates for local labor were consistently at the minimum acceptable levels. Men who worked seasonally for the ranch, helping with roundups or construction projects, received wages that barely covered their basic needs. More disturbing still was the discovery that her father had systematically avoided hiring certain individuals despite their apparent qualifications. Next to several names in his private business notes, he'd written comments like unreliable or not suitable for Ashford standards, but without any explanation of what had led to these judgments. Victoria found herself studying these annotations with growing unease. Had her father been making hiring decisions based on personal prejudices rather than objective qualifications? The man she remembered had been fair-minded and practical, but perhaps there were aspects of his character she'd never fully understood. The contrast between her family's accumulated wealth and the economic struggles of their neighbors became even sharper when Victoria ventured into town to observe the daily rhythms of community life. She watched women haggling carefully over the price of basic supplies, saw children wearing clothes that had clearly been mended multiple times, and noticed the way people counted their coins twice before making even small purchases. Meanwhile, Reuben continued his tireless routine of dual employment, his reputation for reliability and skill earning him steady work despite his apparent lack of connections to the town's established families. Victoria began to understand that his independence wasn't just a matter of pride, it was a survival strategy in a community where social standing could determine economic opportunity. During one of her evening observations at the saloon stables, Victoria witnessed an interaction that highlighted the respect Reuben commanded despite his modest circumstances. A wealthy rancher from a neighboring county had brought his prize stallion to town, and the animal had become increasingly agitated in the unfamiliar environment. "Your stable boy doesn't seem to know what he's doing," the rancher complained loudly to the saloon owner. "That horse is worth more than this whole establishment, and he's treating it like some common plow animal." Victoria watched from the shadows as the saloon owner approached Reuben, clearly uncomfortable about having to relay the criticism. But instead of taking offense, Reuben simply nodded and adjusted his approach to the stallion, speaking in even softer tones and moving with even greater care. Within minutes, the agitated animal had calmed considerably. The rancher, despite his initial complaints, found himself watching with growing interest as Reuben demonstrated techniques for managing high-strung horses that clearly came from years of experience with quality. "Animals, where did you learn to handle horses like that?" the rancher eventually asked, his tone shifting from criticism to curiosity. "Here and there," Reuben replied diplomatically. Continuing his work without elaborating on his background, the rancher pressed for more details, clearly interested in hiring someone with such obvious skill, but Reuben deflected the inquiries with polite non-answers. Victoria realized he was protecting himself from questions that might reveal his connection to the Ashford ranch and the circumstances of his departure. Later that week, Victoria's investigation of the ranch's business practices led her to an uncomfortable discovery about her family's relationship with the local bank. The Ashfords held significant influence over lending decisions, and Victoria found correspondence suggesting that her father had occasionally used this influence to affect who could and couldn't obtain credit for business ventures. The implications troubled her deeply. In a small community like Sundown Ridge, access to credit could mean the difference between success and failure for aspiring entrepreneurs. If her father had used the family's financial power to favor some individuals over others based on personal preferences rather than business merit, it represented an abuse of position that violated everything Victoria believed about fair dealing. She began to see how the ranch's prosperity was built not just on hard work and good management, but on a network of advantages and privileges that most residents of Sundown Ridge could never access. Her family's success had created opportunities for some, while limiting them for others, and she was beginning to suspect that Reuben might have been among those whose prospects had been deliberately restricted. The silver pocket watch seemed to tick more loudly as these realizations accumulated. Each evening, as she wound its mechanism and set it on her bedside table, Victoria found herself wondering how many of her family's possessions represented not just inheritance but perhaps injustice as well. Her growing awareness of these disparities made her increasingly uncomfortable with the automatic deference she received as the Ashford heiress. When shopkeepers offered her special prices or rushed to serve her ahead of other customers, she began to recognize these gestures not as kindness but as acknowledgement of economic power that she'd done nothing to earn. Most troubling of all was the gradual realization that Reuben's careful independence might be necessary, protection against a system that had already failed him once. His refusal to accept help, his determination to succeed through his own efforts alone, and his reluctance to discuss his past began to make sense as defensive strategies rather than mere personality traits. Victoria found herself caught between admiration for Reuben's character and growing shame about her family's role in creating the circumstances that made such defenses necessary. The pocket watch, that had once been simply a cherished memento, was becoming a symbol of inherited guilt that grew heavier with each passing day. The discovery that would shatter Victoria's remaining illusions about her family came on a rain-soaked Thursday evening when she finally found the courage to thoroughly search her father's private desk. She'd been putting off this task for weeks, telling herself she was respecting his privacy even in death. But she knew the truth was simpler. She was afraid of what she might find. The locked bottom drawer had always been forbidden territory during her childhood. Her father had kept the key on his personal ring, and even the household staff had strict instructions never to disturb its contents. Now, as the ranch's sole owner, Victoria had both the right and the responsibility to examine every aspect of her inheritance. No matter how personal, the drawer contained what appeared to be her father's most sensitive correspondence, letters marked confidential, legal documents requiring discretion, and a leather portfolio tied with string that bore the inscription "Employee Matters, Private." Victoria's hands trembled slightly as she untied the string and opened the portfolio. Inside, she found personnel files for ranch employees dating back more than 20 years. Most contained routine information, hiring dates, performance notes, salary adjustments, but one file was significantly thicker than the others. The name on the tab made her stomach clench. R. Miller, dismissed. The dismissal letter was written in her father's careful handwriting on official Ashford Ranch letterhead. As Victoria read its contents, she felt her world begin to crumble around her. "Mr. Miller," the letter began, "it is with regret that I must terminate your employment effective immediately. The theft of valuable ranch property under your care cannot be overlooked, regardless of your family's years of loyal service. Your son's involvement in this matter makes it impossible for either of you to remain on Ashford land. You will have until sunset to gather your belongings and vacate the premises." Victoria read the letter 3 times, each reading making her feel sicker than the last. But it was the documents attached behind the letter that truly devastated her. There, in her father's private notes, was the real story of what had happened that terrible day 20 years ago. "The boy took nothing," her father had written in his personal observations. The missing bridle was found in the tack room where it belonged. Miller had simply cleaned and oiled it so thoroughly that it looked different enough to confuse young Tom Brennan. By the time the truth was discovered, I had already dismissed them in anger. My pride will not allow me to admit the error publicly, as it would undermine my authority with other employees. Better to let them think me harsh, but just than weak and incompetent. The notation continued in her father's increasingly difficult handwriting. The boy showed character beyond his years in accepting blame for something he never did. He could have protested his innocence, could have demanded proof, but instead he walked away with dignity intact. "Perhaps I have done them both a favor. They will make their own way in the world, without dependence on Ashford charity." Victoria's hands shook as she continued reading her father's private justifications. He'd convinced himself that allowing an innocent man and boy to be branded as thieves was somehow beneficial to their character. He'd rationalized his refusal to correct the injustice as protection for his own reputation and authority. The final entry in Reuben's file was dated just 2 years ago. "The Miller boy has made something of himself despite our harsh parting. He goes by Cross now, apparently his mother's name, and has earned respect throughout the territory as an honest craftsman. Perhaps his early experience with injustice taught him the value of genuine integrity over inherited position. I find myself oddly proud of his accomplishments, though I will never admit my error publicly." Victoria closed the file with numb fingers, her father's words echoing in her mind like accusations. Everything she'd believed about her family's honor had been built on a lie that had destroyed an innocent young man's future. Her father hadn't been the fair-minded man she'd admired. He'd been a coward who'd chosen his own convenience over justice. The worst part was realizing that her father had known the truth all along. For 20 years, he'd watched Reuben struggle to rebuild his reputation, while knowing that the original stain on his character had been completely undeserved. He'd observed Reuben's success from a distance, even taking pride in it, while never once considering that he owed the young man an apology and public vindication. Victoria thought about all the advantages her family's wealth had provided her: the education in Boston, the social connections, the financial security that allowed her to pursue her interests without worry. Meanwhile, Reuben had been forced to start over with nothing, his family's good name destroyed by her father's pride and unwillingness to admit a mistake. No wonder Reuben maintained such careful distance from her. No wonder he refused offers of help and insisted on absolute independence. He'd learned early that trusting the Ashford family could lead to devastating consequences. And 20 years of silence from her father had only reinforced that lesson. Victoria's hands clenched around the dismissal letter as anger began to replace shock. How could her father have been so callous? How could he have lived with himself, watching an innocent man struggle under the weight of undeserved shame? The man she'd loved and respected had revealed himself to be capable of breathtaking selfishness. But even as rage filled her chest, Victoria realized that her father's moral failing created an opportunity for redemption. She now possessed the proof of Reuben's innocence, documented in her father's own handwriting. She could restore his reputation, clear his name publicly and ensure that everyone in Sundown Ridge knew the truth about what had really happened 20 years ago. The question was whether Reuben would want such vindication. His careful independence suggested a man who'd learned to depend only on himself, who'd built his self-worth on his own accomplishments rather than others' opinions. Would public acknowledgement of the injustice done to him feel like justice, or would it feel like another form of Ashford condescension? Victoria carefully returned the documents to their folder, but she knew there was no returning to ignorance. The truth demanded action, regardless of how complicated that action might prove to be. Her father's cowardice had created a debt that only courage could repay, and she was determined to find a way to honor what her family owed to. The man who'd shown more integrity at 10 years old than her father had managed in an entire lifetime. The dismissal letter felt like it was burning through the leather portfolio as Victoria locked the drawer and tried to plan her next move. Some truths, once discovered, demanded to be acknowledged, no matter how painful the process might prove to be. Victoria's determination to uncover the full extent of her father's deceptions led her deeper into the ranch's legal records than she'd ever intended to go. What started as a search for ways to make amends to Reuben had become an investigation into the very foundations of her family's prosperity. The dismissal letter had opened a door to questions she wasn't sure she wanted answered, but found herself unable to ignore. Hidden behind the employee files, she discovered a metal document box that had been wedged into the back corner of the drawer. The box was secured with a small brass lock, but Victoria found the key taped to its underside, her father's characteristic blend of caution and convenience. Inside were land deeds, survey maps, and legal correspondence dating back to the ranch's earliest days. Among these documents, Victoria found something that made her blood run cold: a yellowed land deed bearing the name Miller Family Trust and describing property that encompassed nearly a third of what was now Ashford ranch land. The deed was dated 15 years before her father's arrival in the territory, and it clearly established the Miller family's legal ownership of prime grazing land along Willow Creek. Victoria's hands trembled as she unfolded the accompanying surveyor's map. The boundaries were clearly marked, and there was no question about the extent of the Miller family's original holdings. This wasn't marginal land or disputed territory. It was some of the most valuable ranch property in the entire valley, complete with water rights and access to the main cattle trails. Attached to the deed was a bundle of letters that told a story of gradual dispossession that made Victoria feel physically ill. The correspondence revealed how her father had systematically acquired Miller land through a combination of legal pressure, financial manipulation, and outright fraud. When Reuben's grandfather had fallen behind on territorial taxes during a particularly harsh winter, her father had paid the debt and claimed legal right to the property as compensation, but the letters revealed that the tax debt had been artificially inflated through her father's influence with territorial officials. What should have been a manageable obligation had been transformed into an impossible burden through bureaucratic manipulation. The Miller family had lost their ancestral land not through honest financial failure, but through calculated theft disguised as legitimate business. The cruelest detail was contained in a letter from Reuben's dying father to the Territorial Land Office. The man had discovered the truth about the manipulated tax assessment and was attempting to challenge the transfer of his family's property. His letter was dignified and carefully reasoned, laying out evidence of the fraud with heartbreaking precision. But the response from the land office was a form letter, explaining that all challenges to property transfers had to be accompanied by a substantial filing fee, more money than a dying man with a young son could possibly raise. The system had been designed to prevent exactly the kind of justice the Miller family deserved, and her father had known precisely how to exploit that design. Victoria realized with growing horror that her father's treatment of Reuben hadn't been an isolated incident of poor judgment. It was part of a pattern of behavior that stretched back decades, a systematic approach to acquiring power and property through the exploitation of legal and social advantages that his victims could never match. The most damning document was her father's personal journal entry. From the week he dismissed Reuben and his father from the ranch, the boy suspects something about his family's original landholdings, he'd written. His questions about the old boundary markers suggest someone has been talking to him about the past. Better to remove them both now before he grows old enough to cause real trouble. The theft accusation provides convenient cover for what is really a preemptive strike against future complications. Victoria felt the room spinning around her as the full scope of her father's calculated cruelty became clear. He hadn't just failed to correct an innocent mistake. He deliberately destroyed Reuben's reputation to prevent the young man from investigating his family's stolen inheritance. The dismissal had been a strategic move designed to discredit Reuben before he could discover the truth about his grandfather's land. But perhaps the most devastating revelation was contained in the final document in the box, a hidden will that her father had never filed, written just months before his death. In it, he'd acknowledged his crimes against the Miller family and left instructions for the return of their original landholdings to Reuben. The will was signed and witnessed, legally binding if it had been properly filed with the territorial court. Instead, her father had hidden it away, apparently unable to bring himself to make the restitution he knew was morally required. Even facing his own mortality, he'd chosen to burden his daughter with the knowledge of his crimes rather than take responsibility for making them right. Victoria's careful composure finally shattered as she sat alone in her father's study, surrounded by evidence of betrayals that stretched back generations. Her entire life had been built on stolen land and destroyed reputations. Every comfort she'd enjoyed, every advantage she'd been given, had been purchased with someone else's birthright. The sound of footsteps on the front porch interrupted her emotional breakdown. Through the window, she could see Tom Brennan approaching with what appeared to be ranch business that required her attention. Victoria quickly gathered the incriminating documents and locked them back in the drawer, but she knew there was no returning to ignorance now. "Miss Victoria," Tom called as he knocked on the front door. "Sorry to bother you so late, but we've got a situation with the cattle that needs deciding tonight." Victoria composed herself as best she could and went to meet with her foreman. But she felt like she was play-acting the role of responsible ranch owner, while her entire understanding of that responsibility had been fundamentally altered. How could she make decisions about land that didn't rightfully belong to her? How could she profit from an operation built on theft and fraud? Worse still was the realization that she'd been unconsciously perpetuating her father's crimes through her very presence on the ranch. Every day she spent as the Ashford heiress was another day that Reuben was denied his rightful inheritance. Every decision she made about her property was another step away from the justice his family deserved. As Tom explained the cattle situation, a dispute with neighboring ranchers about grazing boundaries, Victoria found herself thinking about much larger questions of boundaries and rightful ownership. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was being asked to defend property lines when the most important boundaries had been redrawn through fraud decades earlier. "We need to stand firm," Tom was saying. "Your father never backed down from boundary disputes, and neither should you. The Ashford ranch has a reputation to maintain." Victoria nodded absently, but internally she was wondering what kind of reputation her family truly deserved. The hidden land deed felt like it was burning through the locked drawer, a tangible reminder that some reputations were built on foundations too rotten to support the weight of truth. The question now wasn't just how to make amends to Reuben for the injustice of his dismissal, it was how to restore an entire family legacy that had been stolen before he was even born. The scope of the betrayal was so vast that Victoria couldn't immediately see how justice could ever be fully served. But she knew with absolute certainty that the effort had to be made. Whatever the cost to her own comfort and security, the Miller family's land had to be returned to its rightful owner. Victoria spent 3 sleepless nights wrestling with the weight of her discoveries before she found the final piece of evidence that would complete the devastating picture of her family's crimes. Hidden beneath the false bottom of her father's personal desk drawer, she discovered a bundle of letters tied with a faded ribbon, correspondence that broke her heart and strengthened her resolve in equal measure. The letters were written in a woman's careful handwriting, addressed to various territorial officials, newspaper editors, and anyone else who might listen to a poor widow's plea for justice. They were signed Margaret Miller Cross, Reuben's mother, who had apparently taken her maiden name after her husband's death, explaining why Reuben now carried the surname Cross instead of Miller. The letters painted a picture of a woman fighting desperately to restore her family's good name and reclaim their stolen inheritance. Margaret had spent years researching property records, interviewing old-timers who remembered the original boundaries and gathering evidence of the fraud that had dispossessed her family. Her writing grew more urgent and desperate as her health declined. But her determination never wavered. "My son deserves to know the truth about his heritage," she wrote in one particularly heartbreaking letter to the territorial governor. "He works harder than any man should have to, believing he must earn through sweat what was stolen from his grandfather through deceit. If justice cannot be served in my lifetime, perhaps it can be achieved for the next generation." The final letter in the bundle was dated just weeks before Margaret's death, addressed to no one in particular but clearly meant as a testament for her son. In it, she laid out the complete story of the Miller family's dispossession, including details that even Victoria's father's private records hadn't contained. She'd uncovered the network of corruption that had made the theft possible, identified the specific officials who'd been bribed, and documented every step of the fraudulent process. "I have failed to restore what was taken from us," Margaret wrote in her increasingly shaky handwriting. "But I pray that someday someone with the power to act will read these words and understand that justice delayed is not justice denied. My son Reuben is a good man who deserves better than the burden of shame our family has carried. If there is any fairness left in this world, he will someday inherit not just the land that was stolen from us, but the honor that was taken along with it." Victoria found herself crying as she read these final words from a woman she'd never met, but whose love for her son radiated from every line of faded ink. Margaret Miller Cross had died believing she'd failed her family, never knowing that her carefully documented evidence would eventually find its way to someone with the power to act on it. But the letters also revealed something that made Victoria's decision both easier and more urgent. Margaret had shared everything with Reuben before her death. He knew about the stolen land, knew about the fraudulent tax manipulation, knew that his family's poverty had been artificially created by Ashford greed. He'd been carrying this knowledge for years, working twice as hard as necessary while watching the people who destroyed his family prosper from their theft. The realization explained so much about Reuben's behavior, his fierce independence, his refusal to accept help, his careful distance from anything connected to the Ashford name. He wasn't just protecting himself from disappointment. He was protecting himself from the rage that knowledge of such injustice could inspire. Victoria spent the next 2 days preparing for what she knew would be the most difficult conversation of her life. She gathered all the evidence: the original land deed, her father's private admissions, Margaret's letters, and the hidden will that should have made everything right years ago. She also consulted with the territorial attorney about the legal process for transferring property and correcting historical injustices. The lawyer, a practical man named Hamilton Pierce, was blunt about the challenges she would face. "Legally, you have every right to transfer the property," he explained. "The original deed is clear, and your father's written admissions would support any claim. But practically speaking, this will cause tremendous upheaval. Other families have bought land from your father over the years, thinking they were making legitimate purchases. Correcting one injustice might create others. Then we'll deal with those complications as they arise, Victoria replied firmly. But first, we have to address the central wrong that made all the others possible. Pierce nodded approvingly. Your father was a complex man, Miss Ashford, capable of great generosity in some areas, but clearly troubled by secrets he couldn't bring himself to address. You're showing considerable courage in facing what he couldn't. Victoria's plan was straightforward in concept, but would require careful execution. She would approach Reuben privately first, showing him the evidence and offering to transfer the land immediately. If he accepted, she would then make a public announcement at the next town meeting, ensuring that everyone in Sundown Ridge understood the truth about the Miller family's heritage and the Ashford family's crimes. But first, she had to face the man whose life had been shaped by her family's betrayals, and find words adequate to express not just regret, but genuine commitment to justice. The opportunity came on a Friday evening when Victoria saw Reuben working alone at the church construction site, taking advantage of the longer daylight to make progress on detailed trim work. The other workers had gone home to their families, leaving him to focus on the precise craftsmanship that had made his reputation. Victoria approached slowly, her heart pounding with nervousness and determination. She carried a leather satchel containing all the evidence she'd gathered, but she knew that documents alone wouldn't be enough to bridge the chasm of hurt and mistrust that years of injustice had created. Reuben, she called softly as she reached the edge of the construction area. He looked up from his work, his expression guarded but not unwelcoming. Miss Ashford, bit late for inspecting the progress, isn't it? I'm not here about the church, Victoria said, her voice steadier than she'd expected. I'm here about your family's land. The change in Reuben's expression was immediate and dramatic. His face went carefully blank, but Victoria could see the tension that suddenly gripped his entire body. He set down his tools with deliberate precision and straightened to his full height. I don't know what you mean, he said quietly. Yes, you do, Victoria replied, pulling the original land deed from her satchel. You know exactly what I mean, because your mother made sure you knew the truth before she died. Reuben stared at the document in her hands for a long moment before meeting her eyes again. When he spoke, his voice carried 20 years of carefully controlled pain. What do you want, Victoria? The use of her first name, after weeks of formal address, felt like a small miracle. It suggested that perhaps the barriers between them weren't completely insurmountable. I want to make it right, she said simply. All of it. The land, the lies, the reputation my father destroyed. I want to give you back everything that was stolen from your family. Reuben's laugh was bitter and short. And what makes you think I want anything from an Ashford? What makes you think I'd accept charity from the family that destroyed mine? Because it's not charity, Victoria said firmly. It's justice. And because I have proof that you're not just entitled to this land, you're entitled to an apology that's 20 years overdue. She held out Margaret's letters, watching as recognition flickered in Reuben's eyes. Your mother never gave up fighting for your family's honor. Maybe it's time someone with the power to act finally listened to what she was trying to say. Reuben's hands shook as he took his mother's letters from Victoria, his careful composure finally cracking after years of iron self-control. He didn't read them, he didn't need to. The sight of his mother's handwriting was enough to bring back memories of her final months, when she'd worked feverishly to document the injustices that had shaped their family's fate. She spent her last winter writing those letters, he said quietly, his voice rough with emotion. Stayed up nights by candlelight, determined to leave me proof of what really happened. I tried to tell her it didn't matter anymore, that we'd built a good life despite everything, but she wouldn't let it go. Victoria watched as 20 years of carefully buried pain surfaced in Reuben's expression. The strong jaw that had carried him through countless hardships trembled slightly, and she could see the young boy he'd once been struggling against the man's determination to maintain dignity, even in this moment of vulnerability. She loved you very much, Victoria said softly. Everything she wrote was about making sure you knew the truth about your heritage. She documented every detail, every piece of evidence she could find. Your mother never gave up fighting for your family's honor. The truth, Reuben repeated, his voice carrying the weight of decades of suppressed bitterness. You want to know the truth, Victoria? The truth is that your father destroyed my family not once, but 3 times over. First when he stole our land through fraud and manipulation, then when he branded us as thieves to cover his tracks and protect his reputation. And finally, when he let us carry that shame for 20 years, watching us struggle while knowing he could have cleared our name with a single honest word. The words hung between them like an indictment, each one carefully chosen and devastating in its accuracy. Victoria felt the full weight of her family's crimes settling on her shoulders. But she didn't flinch from their burden. My father died believing he'd failed as a provider, Reuben continued, his voice breaking slightly. He spent his last years thinking he'd somehow let our family down, that he hadn't been strong enough or smart enough to hold on to what his own father had built. He never knew that his failure had been manufactured by someone he'd trusted, someone he'd worked for honestly and faithfully. Victoria's heart ached as she imagined the dying man's sense of inadequacy, never knowing that forces beyond his control had been working against him from the beginning. I'm so sorry, Reuben. There are no words adequate for what my father did to your family. He knew, Reuben said, looking up at her with eyes that held 2 decades of accumulated pain. When you told me that about him knowing I was innocent, that was the worst part. I could understand anger, even unfair anger. I could understand pride making a man reluctant to admit a mistake quickly. But 20 years, Victoria, 20 years of watching me work twice as hard as everyone else, trying to prove I was worthy of basic respect. And he knew the whole time that I'd done nothing wrong. The revelation seemed to have broken something fundamental in Reuben's carefully constructed defenses. Victoria could see the boy who'd taken blame for something he'd never done, the young man who'd started over with nothing, and the adult who'd built a reputation through sheer force of character despite carrying an undeserved burden of shame. Every job I took, every person I had to convince to trust me, every time someone looked at me with suspicion because they'd heard whispers about the Ashford ranch. Stable boy who'd been caught stealing. Your father could have stopped all of that with a single public statement. Reuben's voice grew stronger as the full scope of the betrayal became clear to him. Instead, he let me build my entire adult life around proving I wasn't the thief he'd branded me as. Victoria felt her own anger rising, not at Reuben's words, which were entirely justified, but at her father's cowardice and the magnitude of suffering it had caused. He was wrong, Reuben, terribly, unforgivably wrong. But I can't change what he did or failed to do. I can only try to make sure his cowardice doesn't define how this story ends. She pulled her father's seal ring from her pocket, the heavy gold band that had been a symbol of Ashford authority for as long as she could remember. This ring signed the documents that stole your family's land. It authorized your dismissal from the ranch. It sealed every piece of correspondence that built the wall of lies around your family's reputation. Reuben stared at the ring, his expression a mixture of recognition and something that might have been revulsion. The symbol of power that had shaped his life so destructively seemed to pulse with malevolent energy in the lamplight. I can't undo what my father did, Victoria continued, her voice growing firmer with determination. But I can make sure it ends here tonight, with truth instead of lies. I'm prepared to transfer the Miller family land back to you immediately, with full legal documentation and public acknowledgement of your family's rightful ownership. And I want to clear your name publicly so that everyone in this territory knows the truth about what happened 20 years ago. Reuben looked up from the ring to meet her eyes, searching her face for any sign of deception or hidden agenda. And what would that cost you? Everything I inherited that wasn't rightfully mine, Victoria admitted honestly. The ranch will be smaller, my inheritance reduced to what my family actually earned rather than what they stole. Some people will think I'm a fool for giving away valuable land. Others will see it as an admission that the Ashford name isn't worth preserving. Why? The question came out as barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a lifetime's worth of accumulated hurt. Why would you sacrifice so much for something that happened before you were even born? You could keep all of this, let the past stay buried, and no one would blame you for your father's crimes. Victoria moved closer, her voice gentle but unwavering in its conviction. Because some things matter more than money, or social position, or protecting family reputation. Because your mother deserved to see justice done in her lifetime. And even though we can't give her that satisfaction, we can honor her memory by doing what's right now. She held out the seal ring, the symbol that had represented Ashford power and privilege for decades. And because the boy who carved me a wooden horse and took blame for something he never did deserves to have his family's honor restored, regardless of what it costs me personally. Reuben stared at the ring for a long moment, and Victoria could see the internal struggle playing out across his features. Part of him wanted to reject anything connected to the Ashford name, to maintain the independence he'd fought so hard to achieve. But another part, the part that remembered his mother's final years of desperate letter writing and his father's dying sense of failure, recognized that this moment represented the justice his family had been denied for 2 decades. My mother always said that justice delayed wasn't justice denied, he said softly, his voice carrying a note of wonder, as if he was finally beginning to believe her words might be true. She used to tell me that someday someone with the power to act would understand what had been done to us and choose to make it right. She was right, Victoria said, extending the ring toward him again. The justice may have been delayed, but it doesn't have to be denied forever. Reuben reached out slowly, his calloused fingers closing around the gold band that had been both symbol and instrument of his family's destruction. As he held it, something seemed to shift in his posture, not just acceptance, but a kind of resolution that spoke to years of carried burdens finally finding release. There's going to be a town meeting next week, Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. The whole community will be there to discuss the new church dedication and other business. I want to use that opportunity to make a public statement about your family's land and your father's innocence. Everyone who matters will hear the truth directly from me, with documentation to support every claim. People won't understand, Reuben warned, though there was less resistance in his voice than before. They'll think you've lost your mind, giving away prime ranch land to a former stable hand. The social consequences alone, let them think what they want, Victoria interrupted, with a smile that felt lighter than any expression she'd worn in months. The only opinion that matters to me in this is yours. Will you accept what rightfully belongs to your family? Reuben was quiet for a long time, turning the seal ring over in his hands and seeming to weigh not just her offer, but everything it represented. When he finally looked up, his eyes held a depth of emotion that took Victoria's breath away, gratitude, mixed with something that might have been the beginning of forgiveness. My mother always said that justice delayed wasn't justice denied, he repeated quietly. I guess it's time to find out if she was right about that too. The Sundown Ridge Town Hall had never hosted a gathering quite like the one that assembled on the following Tuesday evening. Word had spread through the community like wildfire that Victoria Ashford planned to make an important announcement about ranch business, and the prospect of hearing from the territory's wealthiest landowner had drawn nearly every adult resident within a day's ride. Victoria stood at the front of the crowded room, acutely aware of the curious and expectant faces turned toward her. She'd spent days preparing her words, practicing in front of her mirror and rehearsing with Tom Brennan, but now, faced with the reality of making her father's crimes public knowledge, she felt the full weight of what she was about to do. In her hands, she held the original Miller family land deed, the document that would restore Reuben's inheritance and forever change how the community viewed the Ashford legacy. The hall itself seemed to pulse with anticipation. Farmers and ranchers sat shoulder to shoulder with shopkeepers and craftsmen, their usual social divisions temporarily forgotten in shared curiosity about what could possibly require such a formal gathering. Children peered around their parents' shoulders from the back rows, and even some of the saloon girls had slipped in to hear what the refined lady from the big ranch had to say. "Friends and neighbors," Victoria began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed room, despite the nervous tremor she felt in her chest. "I've asked you here tonight because I have discoveries to share that concern not just my family, but the entire foundation of trust and justice in our community." She could see Reuben sitting in the back row, his expression carefully composed, but his hands clasped tightly in his lap. They'd agreed that he would let her speak first, allowing the truth to come from the family that had created the injustice. Beside him sat several of the men who'd worked with him on various construction projects, their faces showing the same mixture of curiosity and concern that marked the entire gathering. 20 years ago," Victoria continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm, "my father dismissed Reuben Cross and his father from our ranch under accusations of theft. For 2 decades, this community has carried certain assumptions about that dismissal, assumptions that affected how the Cross family was viewed and treated. Tonight, I want to tell you what really happened that day, and in the years that followed." A murmur ran through the crowd as people leaned forward, sensing that something significant was about to be revealed. Victoria could see Mayor Whitman in the front row, his expression shifting from polite attention to sharp focus as he realized this wasn't going to be a routine business announcement. "These are my father's own words," Victoria said, pulling out her father's private confession and holding it where everyone could see the familiar handwriting. "Written in his personal business records and never intended for public view. I quote, 'The boy took nothing. The missing bridle was found in the tack room, where it belonged. Miller had simply cleaned and oiled it so thoroughly that it looked different enough to confuse young Tom Brennan. By the time the truth was discovered, I had already dismissed them in anger. My pride will not allow me to admit the error publicly, as it would undermine my authority with other employees." The murmur became a buzz of shocked conversation as the implications sank in. Victoria waited for quiet before continuing, watching as people turned to look at Reuben with expressions that shifted from surprise to outrage on his behalf. "Reuben Cross was innocent of any wrongdoing," Victoria said, her voice ringing with conviction. "He was 10 years old when he was branded a thief and cast out of the only home he'd ever known. My father knew this, documented it in his private papers, and chose to let an innocent child carry that burden of shame rather than admit his mistake publicly." She could see the faces in the crowd changing as they processed this. Information, surprise giving way to outrage as they realized the scope of the injustice. These were people who'd known Reuben as an adult, who'd witnessed his character and integrity firsthand, who'd seen him work harder than anyone else while maintaining a reputation for absolute honesty. The idea that he'd been falsely accused clearly resonated with their own observations of his character, but the theft accusation was only the beginning of the injustice done to the Cross family, Victoria said, her voice taking on a harder edge as she prepared to reveal the deeper betrayal. She held up the yellowed land deed, its aged paper crackling slightly in her hands. "This document, which I discovered hidden in my father's private files, proves that Reuben's grandfather was the original legal owner of nearly 3,000 acres of what is now Ashford ranch land." The room erupted in shocked exclamations and heated discussions. Victoria had expected this reaction, but the reality of it was still overwhelming. She was watching her family's reputation crumble in real time, seeing the careful construction of decades of respect and authority dissolve as the truth emerged. "The Miller family lost this land not through honest financial failure," Victoria continued, raising her voice to be heard over the commotion, "but through a systematic campaign of fraud orchestrated by my father. He manipulated tax assessments through bribery of territorial officials, creating artificial debt that the Miller family could never hope to repay. then seized their property as compensation for the fraudulent obligations. Mayor Whitman had risen from his seat, his face pale with shock. "Miss Ashford, are you saying that your father deliberately—" "I'm saying that my father stole the Miller family's inheritance through criminal fraud," Victoria interrupted, her voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I have documentation of the bribes, correspondence detailing the tax manipulation, and my father's own private admissions of guilt. This community has been built on a foundation of lies that have allowed my family to prosper while the rightful owners of that land have struggled in poverty." The silence that followed was deafening. Victoria could feel the weight of dozens of stares as people tried to comprehend what they'd just heard. Some faces showed anger, others confusion, and a few reflected the kind of dawning understanding that comes when long-suspected truths are finally confirmed. "Therefore," Victoria said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to announce, "effective immediately, I'm transferring ownership of the Miller family's original land holdings back to Reuben Cross, along with full water and mineral rights as specified in the original deed. The transfer documents have already been prepared and will be filed with the Territorial Land Office tomorrow morning." The silence stretched longer this time, broken only by the sound of someone's sharp intake of breath. Victoria was voluntarily giving away land worth more than most of the people in that room would see in several lifetimes, and doing it in a way that ensured there could be no backing down, no quiet reversal when emotions cooled. "Furthermore," Victoria continued, her voice gathering strength from the rightness of what she was doing, "I want this community to know that Reuben Cross comes from a family of honest, hard-working people who were victims of crimes that should never have been committed in a just society. Any shame or suspicion that has followed his name should be transferred to where it rightfully belongs, to my family's legacy of greed and cowardice." She turned to look directly at Reuben, who had risen from his seat and was making his way toward the front of the room. His face showed a mixture of gratitude and overwhelming emotion that made Victoria's chest tighten with shared feeling. Here was a man who'd spent 20 years carrying an undeserved burden, and she was finally offering him the vindication his mother had died, believing would never come. "The original deed," Victoria said, extending the document toward him with hands that barely trembled, "belongs to you and always has." Reuben's hands were steadier than hers as he accepted the deed, his calloused fingers handling the fragile paper with reverence. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the silent hall, reaching every person present with its quiet dignity. 20 years ago, my mother told me that someday justice would come, even if we couldn't see how it would arrive or who would bring it," he said, his gaze sweeping across the crowd before returning to Victoria. "She spent her final years gathering evidence and writing letters, trying to clear our family's name and restore what had been stolen from us. She died believing she had failed, but she was wrong. She gave me the truth, and that truth has finally found someone with the courage to act on it." He turned to face the crowd, holding the deed that represented not just land, but vindication for his entire family line. "I accept this inheritance not as charity from the Ashford family, but as the restoration of what was stolen from my grandfather and the clearing of shame that was wrongly placed on my father's name. This deed represents justice delayed but not denied, and it honors the memory of my mother, who never stopped believing that truth would eventually prevail over lies." The room remained silent for a moment longer, the weight of the revelations settling over the community like dust after a storm. Then Mayor Whitman began to applaud, slowly at first, then with increasing enthusiasm. Others joined in, and soon the entire hall was filled with applause that felt like more than simple approval. It felt like a community's acknowledgement that justice, however delayed, had finally been served, but Victoria knew that the real test would come in the days and weeks ahead, as the community absorbed the full implications of what they'd learned and decided how to move forward with this new understanding of their shared history. For now, though, it was enough that the truth had been spoken and heard, that Reuben's family honor had been publicly restored, and that the long silence that had protected her father's crimes had finally been broken. 6 months later, Victoria stood on the porch of what had once been the grand Ashford ranch house, watching the sunset over a landscape that looked much the same, but felt completely different. The transfer of the Miller family land had been completed with surprising efficiency, thanks largely to the community's support and the clear documentation of the original injustice. What had initially seemed like it might tear Sundown Ridge, in part had instead brought the community together in ways that no one had anticipated. The changes to Victoria's life had been as dramatic as she'd expected, but not nearly as devastating as she'd feared. The reduced ranch was still profitable, though it required more careful management and closer attention to expenses than the sprawling operation her father had built through fraud and manipulation. Victoria had discovered that she possessed a practical intelligence for business that her privileged upbringing had never allowed her to develop. Working within constraints had taught her skills that unlimited resources never could have provided. More importantly, she'd found a sense of purpose that had been missing during her years of inherited comfort. Each decision she made now was informed by considerations of fairness and community impact, rather than simply maximizing profit. The ranch had become a business she could be proud of, rather than merely one she'd been born to own. Her employees respected her not for her family name, but for her fair dealing and honest leadership. The initial social consequences had been mixed, but ultimately more positive than Victoria had anticipated. Some of the territory's established families had initially shunned her, viewing her public confession of her family's crimes as a betrayal of class solidarity. But these reactions had been more than offset by the respect she'd gained from working people, who saw her actions as proof that justice could transcend social boundaries. The sound of approaching horses drew her attention to the main road, where she could see Reuben riding toward the house with Tom Brennan at his side. The two men had developed a strong working relationship over the past months, collaborating on projects that benefited both properties while respecting the new boundaries that divided the land. Their partnership had become a model for cooperation that other ranchers in the territory were beginning to emulate. Reuben had transformed in ways that went far beyond his change in circumstances. The constant tension that had marked his earlier interactions with Victoria had been replaced by a relaxed confidence that spoke to the relief of finally living without secrets or shame. He'd hired several local men to help develop his property, creating jobs and contributing to the community's economic growth in ways that Victoria's father's hoarding of opportunity had never allowed. Evening. "Victoria," Reuben called as he dismounted near the front steps. The easy familiarity of his greeting still surprised her sometimes after so many years of formal distance. But more than that, she could hear in his voice the warmth that had been missing from their earlier interactions. The sound of a friendship being rebuilt on a foundation of honesty rather than hidden resentment. "Evening, Reuben, Tom." Victoria smiled at both men, genuinely pleased to see them. Their regular visits had become a highlight of her week, offering both practical collaboration and personal connection that enriched her life in ways she was still discovering. "How did the boundary survey go?" "Clean and clear," Tom reported with satisfaction, dismounting and tying his horse to the porch rail. "No disputes about where one property ends and the other begins. Everything matches the original deed exactly, just like we expected." The boundary survey had been Reuben's idea, a way of ensuring that there could never be any question about property lines or legitimate ownership. It was typical of his approach to his restored inheritance, careful, thorough, and designed to prevent any future conflicts or misunderstandings. He'd learned from his family's painful history that legal clarity was essential for protecting what was rightfully his. "There's something else we wanted to discuss with you," Reuben said, reaching into his saddlebag to pull out a folded document. Tom and I have been talking about a proposal that might benefit both our operations, and we think you'll find it interesting. Victoria accepted the document, noting the official letterhead of the Territorial Land Office and the careful legal language that marked formal business correspondence. As she read, her eyebrows rose with interest and surprise at the scope and sophistication of what was being proposed. "A partnership agreement?" she asked, looking up at both men with genuine curiosity. "Equal partners in a joint cattle operation," Reuben explained, his voice carrying the enthusiasm of someone who'd found a solution to a complex problem. "We'd combine our herds, share expenses and labor, and split the profits according to the land and resources each property contributes. Tom thinks it would make both ranches more efficient and profitable than either could be operating independently." Victoria studied the proposal more carefully, impressed by the thoroughness of the planning and the attention to detail that characterized every aspect of the agreement. The document addressed potential conflicts, established clear decision-making procedures, and created mechanisms for resolving disputes that might arise. It was the work of people who understood both the practical challenges of ranching and the importance of maintaining good relationships between partners. "This is remarkably well thought out," she said, noting the careful balance of interests that the agreement maintained. "But are you sure you want to tie your success to mine? You've worked so hard to establish your independence, to prove that you could succeed on your own merits. Wouldn't a partnership compromise that achievement?" Reuben's smile held warmth that reminded Victoria of the boy who'd once carved her a wooden horse, but it was tempered by the wisdom that came from years of hard-earned experience. "Independence isn't about refusing all help or avoiding all connections, Victoria. It's about being able to choose your partners from a position of strength rather than desperation. When I was starting over with nothing, any partnership would have been charity disguised as business. Now I can offer as much value as I receive." Tom nodded emphatically. "He's right, Miss Victoria. Reuben's proven himself as a rancher just like he did as a carpenter. His land has the best water sources in the valley, and his cattle operation is already showing innovative approaches that could benefit all of us. This wouldn't be charity in either direction. It would be good business." Victoria felt a warmth spreading through her chest as she considered the implications of what they were proposing. The partnership would represent more than just business efficiency. It would be a symbol of how their relationship had evolved, from childhood friendship through years of separation and injustice to something entirely new and potentially wonderful. They were no longer the ranch owner's daughter and the stable boy, nor were they the guilty heiress and the wronged victim. They were equals, both shaped by their experiences, but no longer defined by the circumstances of their past. They could work together not because one owed the other a debt, but because their combined strengths could achieve more than either could accomplish alone. "There's one more thing," Reuben said, reaching into his pocket to pull out a small wrapped object. "I wanted to give you this, regardless of whether you agree to the partnership." Victoria unwrapped the cloth to reveal a carved wooden horse, similar to the one she'd discovered in the old stable, but clearly made with adult skill and attention to detail. The craftsmanship was exquisite, showing years of refinement in technique. But the essential gentleness of the maker's touch remained unchanged from the gift she'd received as a child. "It's beautiful," she said, her voice catching slightly as she recognized the significance of the gesture. "But why?" "Because the first one represented a friendship that was broken by circumstances beyond our control," Reuben explained. "This one represents a friendship that's been restored by choice and mutual respect. Whatever happens with the business partnership, I wanted you to know that I consider you a true friend, Victoria. Someone I can trust and respect and enjoy spending time with." The partnership agreement they eventually signed became something more significant than a business document. It was a tangible representation of how justice and forgiveness could create something better than what had existed before. Victoria kept the original in her desk, next to both wooden horses, the old one that had triggered her journey toward truth, and the new one that symbolized the friendship they'd built from the ashes of past betrayals. As autumn approached and their first joint cattle drive proved more successful than either had dared hope, Victoria often found herself reflecting on the changes that had transformed her life. The woman who'd returned to Sundown Ridge 6 months earlier had been trapped by inherited guilt and privileged ignorance. The woman she'd become was someone who'd faced the worst truths about her family's legacy and chosen justice over comfort, relationship over reputation. On quiet evenings, when the ranch work was done and the two partners would sit on the porch discussing plans for the future, Victoria sometimes caught glimpses of the gentle boy who'd been her first real friend. But more often, she saw the man he'd become, someone whose character had been tested by injustice and emerged stronger, someone whose success meant more because it had been earned rather than inherited, someone whose friendship was precious because it had been freely chosen rather than imposed by circumstance. The partnership they'd built was founded on equality, respect, and shared commitment to doing right by their community and each other. It was the kind of legacy Victoria had never expected to create, but one she knew her mother would have been proud of, and one that finally honored the memory of Margaret Miller Cross, who'd never stopped believing that justice would eventually find its way home. Sometimes, on particularly beautiful evenings, when the work was done and the future seemed bright with possibility, Victoria would catch Reuben looking at her with an expression that suggested their partnership might eventually encompass more than just business. But for now, it was enough that they'd found their way back to each other through truth and justice, that they'd built something worthwhile from the wreckage of past betrayals, and that they faced the future as equals and friends. The new deed of partnership rested in Victoria's desk drawer, but its true significance lived in the daily reality of two people who'd learned that some friendships are strong enough to survive injustice, patient enough to wait for truth, and generous enough to create something beautiful from the most difficult circumstances. It was a legacy worth preserving, a story worth telling, and a future worth building together.